this evening into three basic parts. First, talking a little bit about your time at the University of Iowa, then moving into your career, and then a more lengthy discussion on the current state and the future of the profession of journalism and its service to society. But John, let's start with you. You came to the University of Iowa as a graduate student after starting your career. Why Iowa and why graduate school?
Jeff, I have been very fortunate. During my Army years, I had been stationed at the White House, and I was assigned first to President Eisenhower's press secretary, and then John Kennedy came into the White House, and I worked for JFK's press secretary. So I was around journalists all the time in the White House briefing room and also on the road when the presidents would travel. I knew I needed to go to graduate school. I just felt I needed that discipline. And money was a factor. It came down to two choices, Iowa and a school in Boston, which will go unmentioned. And both of them offered me jobs as graduate assistants. Iowa offered me a job at running the news department at the campus-run station WSUI. And so I took it and came to Iowa, and it was one of the best experiences in my life. Do I have time enough to tell you one of the great things that Iowa did for me, though?
Absolutely.
This was during the Vietnam War now. This was 1966. Lyndon Johnson was the president. He was furious with a lot of college students. He talked about those expletive-deleted draft card burners and the students who were organizing anti-Vietnam protest marches. So one weekend, Lyndon Johnson was up at Camp David, and he was stewing about these protests, and he called his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and said, "Dean, I want you to devise a program and send some of those blankety-blank students over to Vietnam and see what we're doing. What we're doing is the right thing." And so the State Department quickly cobbled together a program to send 30 students to Vietnam. You would have to have attended a school that had Southeast Asian studies programs. I had never taken any of those courses, but Iowa had the curriculum. And so I qualified and I was selected, and I went overseas to Vietnam, my first really big reporting experience. And I even got my first break there, or I guess a news broke a story of sorts. I interviewed the American ambassador of South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge. This was for radio. One thing that Iowa had said, we will let you go to Vietnam and we will continue to pay you. All you have to do is file audio reports from Vietnam, and they will also be used on the National Education Radio Network, which today, of course, is NPR. So to go back to the American ambassador, there we go. I pressed him during the interview very hard about, should U.S. troops be in Vietnam? And he finally got mad, uttered an expletive, and said, well, of course we shouldn't be here, but now we're stuck and there's no way to get out.
No
This
kidding.
is not the line that the Johnson administration had been following. So I got a good story out of it, and I've always been grateful to Iowa for being so generous as to let me leave my graduate assistantship at the radio station, WSUI, and go over to Vietnam. It was extremely generous.
That's a fantastic story, John. All these years we've known each other, I hadn't heard that part of that. Thank you for sharing that. Ryan, how about you? How'd you end up in Iowa City?
Well, I'm hardly an example of academic excellence to be held out for recruiting manuals, but I did end up in Iowa, first in Charles City, and then at Drake University, and finally at the University in Iowa City. And all that time, I was essentially working my way through school. I was the stringer for KWWL Channel 7 in Iowa City. And I'll always be eternally grateful to the sheriff of Johnson County for his rough handling of the student protests, the use of tear gas, which made for lots of good stories. I was paid $7 for every film story and $3 for every radio story I filed for KWWL. The film would be shot with my small little Bill and Howell. I had to make the 11:45 bus out of Iowa City, the Greyhound, up to Waterloo in time for the 3:30 film run, and that's how I made my way through college as essentially a stringer for Channel 7.
And so you made that run up Highway 218, a lot of traffic in our city of Waterloo. Hey, can you turn your camera 90 degrees? We've kind of got you on the side.
Oh, okay. Is that any better?
That's perfect. That's perfect. Now,
Okay.
so you come to Iowa City a couple of years ago, and you know where John and Brian are coming in at a time when journalism was booming and was really seen, frankly, in high regard. You know, a lot of young people aren't thinking as journalism as a career when you enroll and you start at the DI. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't come to the University of Iowa entirely settled on journalism. I visited one of the state schools in Illinois because that's where I'm from. I'm from the Chicago suburbs. So I considered going to a school in Illinois. But then I came on a visit for Iowa, and I don't know, it just felt like home right away. So I knew I wanted to come here. And yeah, and then I started working at the DI right when I set foot on campus. And I just really enjoyed the sense of community that we found in the newsroom. I definitely spent more time in there than I did in my dorm room or any of the apartments that I lived in. And so did the other people who were really invested in it. So the sense of community there and just the meaning in what we do and the service we provide to the community, those were all really motivating and meaningful to me.
Do you have a favorite memory as a student, Marissa?
Probably the night that we, the DI staff won Newspaper of the Year at the Iowa Newspaper Association convention. That was in February, the same week as the Iowa caucuses, and a big group of us went to Des Moines, and you know, there was our publisher, our coaches, some of the members of the DI Board of Trustees, and journalists from across the state, and we hadn't won Newspaper of the Year since 1981, so it was a really huge deal for us to win against the Des Moines Register and the Gazette and all these other really great papers in the state with journalists that we look up to. So, you know, our publisher, Jason Drummond, he enjoyed us for some fun the night after our big win. And, you know, I got to see him drop it low to teach me how to Dougie. Hello, Jason, who I know is listening to this. You know, things like that I'll never forget. Yeah, it was just a super fun night and rewarding to see all of our hard work culminate in that.
Well, it was extremely well earned, and again, congratulations on that. Let's turn a little bit now to talk about your careers after graduation. Marissa, we're going to talk about your career in context of the DI as well. But Brian, how has the business of journalism changed over your career? The proliferation of news outlets, the 24-hour news cycle, reporting on things that at one time might have been off the record or off limits that now make it into the public sphere.
Well, I think one of the big changes, I think John would agree with me, is that the Sesame Street generation who wants the news packaged in a minute or a minute 15. A minute 45 or 2 minutes would be considered documentary length on the evening newscast now. They're successful because they put a lot in there, very small pieces. When I first started at NBC, after working my way from Waterloo to Miami to the Cleveland NBC station, I was among the first to do long 3, 4, 5-minute stories. They called them segment threes at the time. And that was a great time to be an investigative reporter because they had the time and the resources to put stories on. Today, that's much more difficult. And as you can see with the cable news channels, which I think largely do set the agenda these days in terms of what's going on, it's a lot of people talking. It's very little reporters going out doing much original work. It is more like when I first started at NBC, a lot of it was look at the morning papers, look at the New York Times, and look at the Washington Post, and then do some version of that for television. That kind of went away, and now it's come back, and that is, I think, a very troubling development. The sort of the original investigative reporting that we saw heydays, in my time at least, of the networks, I think is slipping away. Economic prerogatives.
Mm-hmm. John, how about covering the White House. You know, you covered sort of three different eras of presidents, and then watching how things are done now. How do we report on the president?
It's largely the same, except that there's just more of it. NBC, for example, a network that Brian and I both worked for, now has about 5 people working at the White House. When I first went to the White House, it was only Tom Brokaw, and Tom was being overwhelmed because of the Watergate, which was going on at that time. And he asked me to give up my beat at the Pentagon and come over and help him out at the White House. We also had a fellow who did radio, and that was it. And but now NBC, for example, has its own cable channel, MSNBC. It has CNBC, and it has a very active a website. So in my day, my deadlines were at 7 a.m. Eastern time for the Today Show when I was at NBC, and 6:30 p.m. Eastern time for nightly news. Now there's a deadline every minute. You get a story, you report it. And sometimes networks, for example, will hold stories. Very rarely they want to get up because they're afraid that somebody's going to beat them if they hold it until 6:30, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's a good thing, because reporters now often don't have the time to think about stories, to talk to more sources, and to put stories in the appropriate context.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Marissa, during your time at the DI, you know, if there's a sort of a golden age to cover news at the University of Iowa, you were part of it, and some really heady stuff. I mean, your colleagues covered the murder of a University of Iowa student, $1 billion utilities contract with the university, state funding cuts, budget cuts all over the university. The presidential caucuses were here. I mean, it's only been 6 months ago, but it seems like forever ago. And you played a big role in that when John mentioned Tom Brokaw was here, and you and your colleagues sat down with Tom and cut a segment for MSNBC's Morning Joe that day. And then COVID hits. I mean, right when you think you've got everything going. And on top of that, I want to congratulate you and your colleagues at the DI. For those of you who don't know, the Daily Iowan, after we vacated campus in mid-March, never missed a day of publishing online, and actually put a print edition on the news rack once a week. And it was outstanding work. How'd you manage all that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, you know, it's just what we do. We have to, and it's not an option to cover the news that comes our way. But what makes it all bearable is the incredible teamwork that we had at the DI. I mean, you know, we're fortunate to have a staff of over 100, and that's something that professional newsrooms don't have. You know, sure, we're in and out of class all day, but people there are incredibly committed to covering the news. I mean, of the things you mentioned, there are kind of like 2 different buckets that those things fall into. Like, you know, you mentioned the public-private partnership for the UI's utility system, funding cuts, those things like that, or caucuses. For me, as someone who's into political reporting and accountability reporting and following the money trail, all those things are super fun to report on, and they're huge stories that don't always come every day on the beat. So whenever those opportunities came to report on something as substantial as those things, it was really important. Like, I personally loved covering university news because I'm a first-generation college student. So for me, I found it meaningful to think about things that the audience needed to know and how to best simplify that for people who may not be familiar with the university setting. And then the other bucket of things that you mentioned being the death of Molly Tibbetts and the pandemic. Those things are both incredibly taxing on our newsroom to cover. Necessary stories, but really hard to tell and to tell right, especially in the early months of the pandemic when we didn't know all the things that we knew now about COVID-19, and also just being a senior trying to graduate and find a job through all of that. But, you know, knowing how to delegate stories to people and just think about what the community needs to know through all that. And, you know, the whole time people need access to good, credible information. So knowing that kept us going.
Well, and Marissa, I'm going to stay with you and then go to John, because as sort of beat reporters, where you have something to take on, there could be a tendency to become close to your subjects because you're around them a lot, and you may or may not get to know them on a personal level. And Marissa, I like to point out, you know, when you're covering the UI administration in University of Iowa President Bruce Harold, you're covering the person whose signature is going to be at the bottom of your diploma. How do you keep that professional distance?
Yeah, well, I'm still waiting to eventually get my handshake at graduation from him, you know, since commencement was canceled. So I'll hold him to that. But yeah, so as you mentioned, having covered the UI for 4 years, you know, I really got to know the UI community and the administration. I interviewed President Harold probably more than a dozen times, and he doesn't really grant interviews to most outlets in Iowa other than the DI. So that was a really rare and unique relationship that I was able to form with him. You know, I don't think it's inherently a disadvantage to maintain good relationships with sources as long as they know that when they do something wrong, you'll hold their feet to the fire on it. You know, good relationships help you get tips for future stories and just get the most out of your reporting. You know, Bruce Harold, I think, in his interviews was able to cut to the chase more with me because he understood how I worked as a reporter and that I really knew my subject material. So that definitely was an asset. But ultimately, he also knew that if the university did something wrong, that it was my job to cover that, as much as I might have respected him personally. That was clear with one of the investigative stories I produced. The university had a nearly $4 million change order with Cedar Rapids construction firm Modern Piping. Modern Piping was doing work on Hancher and the Stead Family Children's Hospital, and there were some cases in litigation in 2017 about that, and the UI wanted to keep Piping off as a subcontractor on the pharmacy building and paid around $4 million to do that. So, you know, telling stories like that, the UI administration knew that we would pursue those, but also that the DI would keep it fair and balanced by also highlighting the good things going on in the community.
And that was the story where you won Investigative Report of the Year.
Yeah.
John, how about you? When you're working, whether it's on Capitol Hill or the White House, when you're surrounded by the same people every day, how do you maintain those professional relationships?
Well, I'll give an example of the
Disconnected.
My wife, who was a producer, by the way, when I met her, she was producing Meet the Press for NBC. She tells me I'm not speaking loud enough. Is it okay?
Just like a producer.
Yes. You tell me if I need to start yelling. In any case, I knew George H.W. Bush many years before he became president. He lived in Washington, and I knew him socially. And on some Sunday afternoons, he would burn steaks in his backyard and invite his best friend, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, and myself over. And we would sit around and have a beer or two and discuss the events of the day. Later, he becomes the president of the United States. And I think he expected me possibly to go soft on him. I didn't think I was hard on him, but I think I was fair. And he was particularly upset in 1992 when he was running against Bill Clinton. That was the year there was an economic recession. And that's really the reason he lost. Do you remember James Carville said it's the economy, stupid, that year. And I just reported what George Bush was doing. He wasn't doing much about the economy. He said it was like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And so he did no harm, but he didn't do anything else either. He loses the election. On the day he's leaving the White House, I tried to say goodbye to him, but he cut me dead. And I felt bad about that, but I felt I had done my job and let the chips fall where they may. A year later, I get a handwritten letter the former President Bush, saying he felt I was a real pro and let's try to keep in touch. It was an extremely gracious letter, and he was a very classy guy. But it shows the dangers of having somebody who thinks you're their friend, and then you report stories that they don't like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great example. Brian, speaking of stories that people don't like, as an investigative journalist, you've put yourself in harm's way frequently. Have there been times where you start to second guess your career choice in the middle of a project?
Not really, but certainly you do. You make plenty of enemies and not too many friends. But the friends are people who need justice, who have been denied justice, whose voices haven't been heard, and those are the people you think about as you're doing the stories. You know, at one point in 1982, I was down in Central America for NBC on a plane that was hijacked, and we were held hostage for 3 days and 3 nights. And they were about to blow up the plane, the hijackers, when we escaped and we all got out safely. But that was the one time as I sat in the plane and looked across the tarmac. I could see all the cameras there, everybody covering what was going to be, the plane blowing up and me dying, thinking if I had made the right choice in my career. But since that time, nothing worse than that could happen, and it sort of used it as a lesson, like life goes on.
Yeah, that's a pretty telling barometer there, Brian. John and Brian, before we go on and talk about the future or the current state of journalism, Brian, why we have you here, do you have a favorite sort of behind the scenes of network news story?
Oh, so many, you don't want to burn your old friends and so on. John and I were talking as we prepared for this about the fact that Peter Jennings, we both worked for Peter. John and I overlapped both at NBC, where I was just a gog. I wanted to be John Cochran. That was my goal in life. And to sort of get to become a correspondent in his ranks, along with Bud Dancy and John Palmer and Brokaw and Tom Pettit, was just, one of the great privileges of my life. But when we get to ABC, both John and I were recruited by Roone Arledge to jump ship, go to ABC, and work for Peter Jennings. And Peter liked to keep us off guard. And when I first started, you wouldn't appear live on a program. But as it evolved, they wanted the correspondent to come on live afterwards for some telling question from the anchor. And Peter's want was to tell you what the question would be, and then when you were actually on the air, to change it. He would throw you off guard and get a big kick out of that. The fact is, today, those questions and answers, if you watch the David Muir, or even before that, Diane Sawyer and Charlie Gibson, those are scripted within an inch of their life. So there's no mystery about it. The questions are scripted and the answers are scripted to make sure the anchor doesn't look foolish for asking the wrong question, or a question where essentially you don't agree with what he has to say.
Mm-hmm. John, how about you?
Well, since we're in the middle of a terrible pandemic, let me tell you a story about covering President Gerald Ford in 1976. The swine flu epidemic was starting, and I learned on a Monday, it's important that I say it was on a Monday, I learned from 2 reliable sources that week, President Ford was going to announce a plan to inoculate every American for the swine flu. And so that was on a Monday. So that Monday night on NBC Nightly News, I led the news with the story. The White House refused to confirm the story. The reason being, they wanted to get their act together and have a big rollout later in the week. But the trouble with not confirming the story, I was sort of hung out to dry. And Brian knows you just sweat blood during those times, don't you, Brian?
Absolutely, been there.
I know. And your stories always panned out. Well, this went on for about 3 days. And needless to say, some executives at NBC were beginning to wonder about their White House correspondent. Fortunately, on Thursday of that week, the White House finally announced that, yes, the president was going to try to inoculate every American for the swine flu. And I think I had a couple of drinks that night in relief.
The more we start talking about some of these news stories, over the decades. I go back to the Yogi Berra comment of deja vu all over again. I mean, we seem to be seeing some of the same types of things. Maybe just instead of swine flu, it's something called COVID. Let's go to Marissa. And Marissa, we talked about your interest in going into journalism, but as a leader in the newsroom, when you're bringing on, first, second year students, what are you seeing as their interests in going into the profession? What are they hoping to do?
I think that us young journalists see that the need for credible information is still very much there, and that hasn't changed, even though the profession and the might be changing. We have a president who lies to the public. Plenty of fact-checking websites out there that he routinely tells blatant falsehoods. And we're in the middle of a pandemic where journalists and members of the public perhaps are struggling to access data that could help fully understand the scope of this virus and its spread. And people are frustrated. People are losing trust in the media over those types of things. And just we as young people want to change that. That's one aspect of it. And the other thing that I think us young journalists really want to see change is we want to see our newsrooms reconcile with a lack of diversity and a need to represent the communities that we serve fully. Many newsrooms are predominantly white. There's more men in leadership roles than women oftentimes. And to truly tell stories in an authentic way to our communities and to get trust in our reporting from everyone, we need to be better at truly understanding and embracing identities that are different from our own, both on staff and in our coverage.
That's a great, real positive statement, Marissa, and I think a nice way to, and a strong way to segue into the Q&A that Tony Hakes, our producer, is taking through chat. So thank you very much for that. One of the first questions that comes up in the chat, in the Q&A session, is, again, with so much news out there, how do we sort through it all? How do we find what is a credible source and a good story? And let's start with John.
I wish I had a good answer for that. I have friends who I don't want to criticize them, but they rely on some news sites which really aren't news sites. They are opinion sites, but some of them are actually propaganda sites. And these are intelligent people, but they still can't seem to realize that just because a news site, a website says it's a news site, it ain't necessarily so. Now, I know that there are some courses people can take in what's called consumer literacy, I believe, and for news, and that helps. But it's hard. Consumers of the news really have to do their homework and study whether people who are allegedly giving them facts, whether they're really doing that. And sometimes it takes a long time because some people are very, very, very subtle in their, they try to plant their opinion very subtly among legitimate facts. So it takes work to be a good consumer of the news.
Brian, what are your tips?
Well, when the President of the United States tweets a video featuring a quack doctor who talks about demon sperm, that COVID-19 is a hoax, that there's a cure, that hydroxychloroquine is the answer to it, you have to wonder what's going on and what is our role as journalists. It always pains me to see headlines that call the President of the United States a liar. But at some point, I think we have to come to the realization that there are times when he is saying things certainly not true. And the question, did he lie because he knows better or because he just is misinformed? It's a real challenge. And, there's no way to push back the tide of social media. And the question of, who is a journalist? Is somebody who runs a online tweet site or website? Are they the same kind of journalist that John Cochran once was, or that I was when I was at the networks? That's up for grabs. It's a difficult time, but I think generally the answer is, more speech cures bad speech.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things if I'm going to jump in
How,
again,
oh, sure, John.
one of the things that I learned at Iowa, it was in sociology. I was taught that people expose themselves to news that.
John, I think you just got muted. Hey, John, I want you to hold that thought. I think you just went on, I think you went on mute. So I want you to hold that thought because I'd like to come back to it about sociology at Iowa. Marissa, how about you? Then we'll come back to John for his piece
Am I
on.
unmuted? Am I
Oh,
unmuted?
now you are. Marissa, hang tight. We'll see. John, you opened with telling us about your sociology course, and then you went to mute.
One thing that the journalism school did for me, they allowed me to take a lot of good courses outside the School of Journalism, and that included sociology. And I learned about the tendency of people to expose themselves to news or alleged news that they were comfortable with, and they retained news, alleged news that they were comfortable with. And you see that with a lot of the websites right now. When I'm talking about my friends, I urge them to get away from some of the websites they're looking at. But they feel comfortable with those websites, so they still do it.
Marissa is a young but very accomplished professional. What are your pieces of advice for news and media literacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think social media has definitely posed a problem for a lot of people. It's just information overload, and people aren't sure what's fact and what's fiction on there. But I'd say if something evokes an emotional response, that makes people go, oh, those darn Democrats or those darn Republicans. Maybe people need to stop and think why that is and consider the biases of the news source that they're looking at and how reputable it is. As John mentioned, confirmation bias definitely factors into that, and people like to stay comfortable with the beliefs that they already have rather than encounter new information that challenges those beliefs. People can also check things out with other sources. If something's being reported from multiple news organizations and you're not just seeing it from one website, then that's more likely that there's some truth to it. And ultimately, like, social media just is not the place for the most accurate information. It's great to see people utilize social media to mobilize people to register to vote and to inform people about protests if they'd like to participate in democracy that way. But there's a lot of information on there that isn't true, or if it's maybe out there but it doesn't have a source linked to it, then people should take it with a skeptical eye.
So Jeff, at the heart of this, Jeff, though, is the belief by many Americans that the big media are holding back. They're not telling us everything for their own personal or financial interest. And to the extent that we have done that over the years, it's on us to correct it.
Brian, that's a great move to the next question, because we've been receiving a lot of questions through chat about what could be viewed as the oppression of the American journalist, or even the danger of being an international journalist. In the US, it could be, we don't like what you're saying and we're going to make a public forum and say you're not that way. Internationally, you might be jailed or even killed. What do you make of that, Brian?
That's all true. It can often be a high wire act. I can speak personally to that, but it's also the fact that's the job we signed up for. And it's our job to work our way through that as best we can. As bad as it might be for journalists in this country, with the president calling us, enemy of the people, public enemy, think what it is to be a journalist in China or Myanmar or in Egypt. It's much worse. So we still have a First Amendment. We still have a Supreme Court that recognizes that. So we shouldn't go around hanging crepe just yet.
Marissa, what do you think on that topic?
Um, Sorry, can you bring me back to the original question?
Well, we were talking about the oppression of journalists and journalism as a profession. So the downgrading of it publicly by some sources in the U.S. and even the situations internationally where journalists are routinely imprisoned or killed.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like I said before, the need for information is still there. However, there's large segments of the population that don't believe in the media, and you know, if you cover a Trump rally, you'll get the jeers of fake news and things like that. I've never personally felt in like I've been in harm's way in my work. There have been like some situations with the recent Black Lives Matter protests, especially here in Iowa City, where some journalists have perhaps felt a little more at odds with the protesters, just because the protesters view the media as an adversarial force that perpetuates their oppression. Thankfully, for me in Cedar Rapids, I haven't encountered that. But yeah, it truly just brings me back to the earlier point of we need to do a better job of representing our communities for there to be that trust and a view of us as a valid news source.
Jeff, let me just add one thing. The most watched program on television last week was the ABC World News, not the most watched news show, the most watched program on any television network anywhere. The CBS Evening News was the most watched show on CBS for 3 nights last week. So something is still going on that's good.
That sounds like something that we should all see is reaffirming. John, a couple of people have asked the question, can objective news survive in the future, or will it all go to opinion-based programming?
Oh, sure. There'll always be what Brian just said. Mainstream media, NBC, ABC, NBC, they're doing very well now. There'll always be a market out there for news that people can trust, and there'll always be a market out there for news that people just want to go to because of selective exposure and selective retention, as my sociology professor at Iowa used to say. They'll just live alongside each other. But yes, there's still always going to be a big audience, I think, for objective news, fair news.
Brian, a question for you to kick off to the panel. Are there times where you've had trouble separating yourself emotionally from the story? I mean, you've covered, as John has and Marissa has in her career, but covered some really heady, frankly, awful stuff.
Indeed, you know, you do have a connection to people who have been treated badly. I think the one that strikes me most was the investigation I did into the Peace Corps, where the organization founded by John Kennedy, Americans, young ambassadors to the world, the organization becomes so bureaucratic that they were tolerating and covering up the sexual abuse of Peace Corps volunteers around the world. And there was one woman who was killed in Africa because of a complete screw up by the Peace Corps bureaucracy. And I did there have a very strong connection. But nevertheless, you're trained, as you were in Iowa or any good journalism school, to sort of be able to say both sides need to be heard. And in that case, you know, the other side did want to talk about it, and that's fine. But yes, it does take professional training to be able to distance yourself, because you know we're not robots. We do have feelings, we do have emotions, we do connect with people who we're encouraging them to tell their stories to us so we can tell them to the rest of the country, to the world. And that is something that you know does weigh heavily on you.
And Marissa, that emotional closeness can really hit the young professionals at the Daily Iowan, because there's times you're covering your peers and writing stories about people you might have known in Burge Hall or in Sociology 101, or maybe even grown up with. How do the DI journalists handle that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a learning process for us, I mean, there had been a couple of student deaths during my time at the DI. Probably the biggest, most high profile story being the murder of Molly Tibbetts. And it definitely takes a toll on us because, these are people we might have shared classes with or lived with in our residence halls, been on our floor. So a lot of these stories really hit close to home. And I mean, we try to give people the space that if they felt too close to the story, or if, they had a personal connection, like we didn't want that conflict of interest to be part of our reporting. But at the same time, for others in the newsroom who could report on those things, it isn't inherently harmful to be a human. It's definitely an asset to show your sources we are human and we feel this too. With Molly Tibbetts, I think her, especially as a young woman, for the other young women in the newsroom, there's the aspect of vulnerability to it of, this could have been me, this could have been my friends, just this random tragic incident. And, that all lends itself to better reporting because we understand what those things mean for our community.
Marissa, we've been asked, are you planning to stay in Iowa long term?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, how I ended up here to begin with. So, COVID kind of put things into perspective for me. And I had so much more time to reflect on what do I value and what do I want out of my career. And, I wanted to stay here where I had an editor who, my first internship was at the Gazette. So Zach Koczorski, the executive editor, he had been following my work since I was a freshman and especially since my internship. And, I knew that he was someone who truly knew and valued me and what I brought to the table. And that made me feel a lot more confident in my decision to stay here. Because with my DI experience, I love reporting, but I also wanted someone who understood the full range of things that I brought to the table. And also just to keep my support system with my family and my friends from the DI during this time of instability felt really important to me too. But, I really came to love Iowa, the state of Iowa during my time at the UI. So I love it here. I don't know how long I plan to stay here. I do still see Washington, D.C. in my future eventually. But I'd like to do it working my way through potentially state government reporting, hopefully here in Iowa to keep government officials here on their toes where, Iowans really need that access to credible information about what their government's doing. Yeah, we'll see what the future holds for me.
That's really well said, Marissa. We're coming up on the 1 hour mark now of our program. So we're going to go around the table one more time and look at all of you as educated consumers, sort of like asking a chef where he or she goes for dinner. We're going to go one by one and ask you where you go to consume or pick up your news. John, let's start with you.
Well, my wife and I still like to hold newspapers in our hand. Yes, we do get news from our iPhones and so forth and our laptops and iPads, but we subscribe and get every morning the New York Times and the Washington Post. We subscribe also to the Wall Street Journal. So those would be our main news sources in the morning. I also subscribe to the Times of London. Having lived in London for 10 years, I like to keep up on not only the news, what's going on in Great Britain, but also how people overseas view us and what's going on in our country, especially politically. And I religiously watch at least 2 of the network news programs every evening. We do watch the BBC World News also, which comes on about 5 o'clock Iowa time. And I guess we just go around various news sites. And we go to those that we trust. We go to those that we trust. And we're always interested in how even mainstream news media, how different ones will cover the same story differently.
Which is a helpful exercise that we
Mhm.
all see that.
Yes.
Brian, how about you?
Oh, like John, the big three newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, which keep alive the great tradition of original reporting with big staffs that can do it. But I also like to read the Drudge Report. I like to read Breitbart, National Review, to get a sense of all points of view. I miss my favorite anchor, who has apparently retired, Jon Stewart, but I do occasionally watch the evening newscasts, but I don't find them to be that really interesting. If you're watching, and I do keep track of what's going on during the day on Twitter and elsewhere, that the evening newscasts are just sort of a nice recap, a very quick headline summary for those who aren't following it closely. I'm more interested really in, I think Brian Williams' 11th hour program at 11 o'clock on MSNBC is very good. So those are the main sources for me for news.
And Marissa, other than the Gazette and the DI, where do you go?
Yeah, well, then of course, other than those two wonderful local outlets, the Des Moines Register for the state's political reporting. Press Citizen has some really top-notch coverage of local government here, right in Iowa City and Johnson County. And then nationally, I enjoy Politico and the Washington Post. And then also this news organization hasn't fully launched yet. The 19th, they just hired Barbara Rodriguez from the Des Moines Register, but it's a new nonprofit news outlet. It'll be geared toward women and people who've been traditionally underrepresented in news coverage. So I think that'll be a really important news organization to watch to see how they're telling stories and incorporating, different groups that historically have felt unseen in traditional news outlets.
Jeff, if I can just jump in for a minute.
Yes, sir.
Talking about local reporting, one of the great tragedies that's been going on for several years now, and during this pandemic, it's even worse, is just seeing these local news organs going out of business, or they're cutting staffs, and it's just terrible. I don't think I mentioned NPR. That's something that we listen to a lot, and NPR is in deep trouble financially too. So we don't know where that's going to go. But jobs are being lost, and it means that the news is not getting covered adequately in a lot of places right now.
You're right, and especially the local news. That's where you get school board reports and local economic development, high school sports. Those types of things pick up.
And covering state houses too.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are very grateful to our panel for joining us tonight. And again, I want to thank John Cochran, Brian Ross, and Marissa Payne for joining us this evening and participating in Chat from the Old Cap. And the panel and I would like to thank everybody who participated in this edition of Chat from the Old Cap as a viewer or listener.